Okay.
Hello and welcome to episode 110 of Not Reserving Judgment, a podcast about the latest intrigues, triumphs, and outrages in Canadian constitutional law. I'm Josh DeHaas, counsel with the Canadian Constitution Foundation.
And I'm Christine Van Geyn, the CCF's litigation director.
I'm Joanna Barron, CCF's Executive Director, and in today's episode, I'll tell you about why Ontario's legal regulator is considering scrapping the bar exam and why the Attorney General has come out and said he's opposed.
And I'll tell you about a huge victory for free speech that we were a big part of in the form of a new bill that will protect off-duty speech by regulated professionals and also ban mandatory DEI training in Alberta.
And we'll share our bad legal takes of the week, where we take a lighthearted look at some legal opinions that didn't quite land. But first, I'm going to update you on another Alberta bill that we at the CCF are pretty pleased to hear about. One that takes modest but extremely important steps toward healthcare liberty, and one that I hope other provinces will be following soon. So Alberta's proposed a new bill called Bill 11 that will create a new option for physicians to practice in Alberta, that the NDP of Alberta is calling an unprecedented attack on healthcare in this country that will be the beginning of the end of universal single payer healthcare, which is central to Canadian identity. But come on, guys, relax. It's actually a pretty fantastic bill. And if anything, it's too modest and will probably help preserve buy-in for the public universal system by reducing wait times for everyone. So I'm going to explain how this all works and why I find it so exciting. So a lot of Canadians don't realize this, but other than in Ontario, which actually bans all private payment for medical care deemed medically necessary, most provinces do allow doctors to go private. They just have to fund, all of the associated nurses and operating rooms themselves, and they're never allowed to take public payments if they're private. Once they're out, they're out. So in Alberta, that means, for example, there's about 1,200 surgeons opted into the public system, and then there's about 14, or there are 14 who are opted out, which is about 1%. So what Bill 11 will allow surgeons to do is access both the public and the private insurance systems for different patients without having to opt out. And they'll call this flexible practice. And this is really important because the main roadblock to surgeons operating on patients and reducing Canada's horrible wait lists is a lack of access to operating room time in public hospitals. And this has been a problem for decades, and no amount of increased public funding seems to fix it. And so what you have is orthopedic surgeons in Alberta, for example. There's one that the minister has identified who has just 1 day a month of operating room time in the public system. The same thing is true in Ontario and BC. We hear from surgeons that say the same thing, that are getting, for example, in BC as little as 5 hours a month of operating room time. So Bill 11 will simply allow that surgeon to continue serving the patients he's currently serving publicly, while also drawing in private funding to build surgical centers and operate on those patients who are willing to pay privately on those other days when he can't get into the public OR. And so this kind of thing will not make wait lists longer in the public system, despite what some union-funded groups like Canadians for Medicare are going to tell you. It's actually going to make them shorter because they'll be taking Alberta patients who are willing to, part with some money to get their knee fixed now instead of 18 months from now off the public wait lists. And it will also keep them from going to the US or Mexico and keeping that economic activity here in Canada instead. And so the minister has said that Alberta, another point, in favor of this, which the minister said in an interview with the Hub yesterday, was that this will allow Alberta to attract new and good quality surgeons, because what surgeon's going to choose to practice in a place where he or she can only get 1 day a month of operating room time, when they could just go to the US or Europe and build a profitable practice that keeps them busy multiple days a week. So to push back about this, against this inevitable claim that this is going to draw healthcare resources away from the public system, I want to point out that this is actually very cautious. It's actually designed to prevent that, and make sure that no one waits longer than they would have otherwise in the public system by giving the minister the ability to put conditions on which specialties can operate flexibly and how much they need to contribute to the public system before they can take on private care. So for example, that orthopedic surgeon might be required to only do private care after he's done a day a month in the public system. And in fact, the premier has already indicated that this will be at first limited just to certain surgeries. And while the bill itself might allow eventually this to be extended to family medicine, that's not going to happen anytime soon. So it's just surgeries for now and probably just elective surgeries. The bill itself says emergency surgeries and cancer surgeries will never be an option to be paid for privately under this bill, probably because that's politically sensitive. But I actually think that's kind of unfortunate because cancer care wait times are also egregious and could benefit from more operating room time. But it's a good start. So before I hand it over to you, Joanna, I just want to point out that Alberta has not so far faced one very big expected roadblock that you would think would be happening already, which is pushback from the federal government, because the federal government has previously pushed back pretty heavily when provinces try to make any sorts of reform. And the way the feds tend to do this is by saying that allowing any payments higher than what the province pays counts as extra billing under the Canada Health Act, which allows for the federal government to withhold federal health transfers to punish provinces for this type of thing. But the reality is extra billing doesn't mean what the federal government has often interpreted it to mean. It just means that doctors can't double dip. They can't charge the public plan to provide a surgery and then also charge the patient for that surgery. The federal government's misinterpreted this to mean charging any amount higher than what the provincial plan pays, which is not a sensible interpretation of the text of that particular act. And as a result, back in 2023, the Trudeau government fined provinces that were allowing some private diagnostic scans $76 million in health transfers, trying to disincentivize them from allowing any kind of reform. But honestly, Carney could just reverse this Trudeau era interpretation of extra billing tomorrow and give Alberta the green light to do this sort of thing. And I think you should actually come out and say this publicly so that other provinces that want to build up more healthcare capacity, like Alberta, can do this knowing they're not going to face any fines or political attacks from Ottawa. I actually think Mr. Carney is, uniquely placed to make this kind of argument because it's also an elbows up argument. We shouldn't be sending healthcare dollars to the US at a time when we're in a trade war with them, and we're doing that all the time because people can't get their surgeries privately here. So allowing this private care to take place here will not only make us healthier and let us get our knees and our hips fixed quicker, it's also going to create new economic activity. Okay, so Joanna, time to hand it over to you. My question for you is, do you think this goes far enough to actually comply with the constitutional requirements for healthcare liberty?
Well, it's certainly more constitutionally compliant than the status quo in the rest of Canada, and especially Ontario. It removes the element of state coercion that we've pointed out. That's a huge problem for Section 7, which protects life, liberty, and security of the person, and more specifically, prohibits the state from interfering with those interests in ways that are arbitrary, overbroad, or grossly disproportionate. And we were co-hosting an excellent conference on healthcare reform and patient choice last week in Montreal with our friends of the Montreal Economic Institute and secondstreet.org. Jacques Shaouli was there celebrating the 20-year anniversary of his case. And his cases from 2005 is still the anchor here. The Supreme Court, of course, struck down Quebec's ban on private health insurance because the state was simultaneously prohibiting private alternatives and failing to allow functional, timely public care. So state monopoly plus excessive waits. Emphasis on the state monopoly, right? Because the state is not expected to control every aspect of delivery of healthcare, right? But what they are expected to do is refrain from coercive, monopolistic actions that result in deaths. Our friend Colin at secondstreet.org tells us that they're putting out their annual report on people who die on wait lists, which is always in the tens of thousands and is creeping up in this country. So Bill 11 certainly is moving us in the opposite direction. It's giving patients the lawful option to pursue private self-funded treatment within Canada without requiring surgeons to opt out of the public system. Alberta is backing off of that coercion. It's removing a state-imposed barrier. I'm not going to make a final determination. Is this my dream law? But I'm very happy because a system that increases options is far less likely to violate Section 7, the core constitutional defect that the Supreme Court refused to uphold rightfully in Quebec. We still don't know why it doesn't apply in the rest of Canada, but hopefully Alberta is bringing the opening gambit that is going to force the courts to deal with this question. It's this combination of prohibition and harm, and Alberta is taking its hand off our necks, so to speak. So I'm very excited about this. Anything to add, Christine?
Yeah, so this is something I would love to see modeled in other provinces. I think that the best approach is a political solution here. We've obviously tried legal approaches. I think that those approaches should have worked, but the Supreme Court declined to take up that opportunity for some strange
So
reason.
far, so far.
Yeah, so far. I mean specifically in the Canby case. And it's left this bizarre situation where we have an unequal set of rights. If you live in Quebec, you have different access. And, I think we'll have to see what the feds do in response to the Alberta proposal. But what I would like to see is sort of politically a shift in culture about how we talk about healthcare, because I think people are just increasingly becoming exasperated with these myths and sacred cows that are always touted about, like, I need to suffer in a hallway to honor the ghost of Tommy Douglas. I think that was a tweet by Matt Gurney earlier this week. And it's just people don't want to do it anymore. And we have seen these myths just get eviscerated. Like, hollering, this is the Americanization of healthcare, just isn't working with the public anymore. At this conference that you mentioned, Joanna, we have over 60% of people we found in this poll, this Ipsos poll, support allowing private payment for healthcare options for people who can afford it. I mean, get over this idea that it's Americanization. Canada is the only OECD country that prohibits patients from buying private insurance. It's not about America. It's about getting better care for Canadians and allowing us to choose how we access that care. I think people are just not buying this anymore. So I am kind of obsessed with what's happening in Alberta right now. Danielle Smith is like on fire. She's just been doing so many things that I like. And I'm going to talk about another one of them for my news headline. And it is new legislation that the Alberta government has introduced to rein in how professional regulators, that's like medical colleges, law society, teachers colleges, accounting regulators, how they discipline professionals. This has been an issue we at the Canadian Constitution Foundation have been working on for a couple of years now, because it is what I call the new censorship. It's kind of this subtler and more pernicious form of censorship that we don't think about, because it's not the classic, government bureaucrats sitting in a dark room watching movies and deciding what we can watch. It's a regulator who decides if we can have a job if we're in one of these professions. I wrote a long paper about this for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute a few years ago under the name The New Censorship. And I am pretty thrilled with this legislation that's been introduced in Alberta, because I actually think that they read my report and they took it to heart, because they have adopted specifically a number of reforms that I called for. Before I get into what those reforms are, I just want to explain why it matters It matters because censorship by professional regulators is a way of controlling how millions of Canadians can speak. These regulators oversee fields like law, healthcare, accounting, teachers. They are empowered by the government through legislation. So it is a charter issue. And essentially, Canadians in these professions need the government's permission to do their job. And that permission is granted through these professional regulatory bodies that have their own systems of rule and discipline. And what we have seen is this trend where people who are in one of these professions face discipline for things that they say privately, off duty, completely unrelated to their profession. And they get disciplined for the same reasons that speech would attract censorship in classic cases because they're saying something that's heterodox, that's ideologically nonconforming, that's politically unpopular or controversial. Now, the most famous example of this is Jordan Peterson, a clinical psychologist who's quite famous, and he was hauled before a college tribunal for the Ontario College of Psychologists for tweets that he posted that the regulator didn't like, that not patient complaints, just people on X saw things that he had posted and complained to his regulator. And the posts were about climate change, the Freedom Convoy, about critical gender theory. And quite literally, some of the complaints were about jokes that Jordan Peterson made online. So they disciplined him for this. They ordered him to re-education. He appealed that. He was not successful. But the issue is these regulators are clearly going too far. This has nothing to do with his practice of psychology. The role of a regulator is to make sure that someone is competent in their profession, that they don't exploit their clients, that sort of thing. So, for example, the lawyers regulator, the Law Society, is supposed to make sure lawyers have a minimum standard of competency and that they don't steal from trust accounts. Likewise, the medical college is supposed to ensure that doctors have a minimum skill set and that they don't sexually harass their clients. So you can get disciplined for that kind of thing. That's the core competency of the regulator. They're not supposed to be monitoring your X account for your opinions on climate change or the convoy. That is quite obviously going too far, but we see it as an emerging issue. And the report that I did for the Macdonald Laurier Institute has a number of examples. Jordan Peterson is just the most famous, and he was the most famous because he's, a famous person, but also because he fought back. Most people don't have the resources to fight back. And if you look at my report, you'll see there are a number of individuals like this, a nurse who had posted about end of life care that her grandfather had received, a doctor who had posted about her theological religious beliefs about communion. I mean, these are things that the regulator has no business disciplining or cautioning someone for. Now, let me tell you what Alberta has proposed because they see this as a problem, as I do, and so they're trying to fix it. This bill they introduced is called the Regulated Professions Neutrality Act, and it positions professional regulators as strictly focused on the competence, ethics, and public safety of their field rather than the social and political beliefs of their members. So it introduces a number of key changes. First, regulators can't discipline professionals for personal expression outside of their practice unless it involves a threat of violence, the misuse of a professional position to cause harm. So, for example, if you're a doctor and you say, buy my patented snake oil that, hurts you, you might face discipline for that. You can be disciplined if you have criminal convictions, if you engage in sexual misconduct or exploitation, or if you have inappropriate communications with minors. That is still subject to discipline, but private political speech, controversial opinions, or social commentary, that is all protected. The regulator has no business disciplining someone for that. The second thing the bill does is it requires regulatory neutrality. So regulatory bodies can't adopt or promote principles of things like DEI. This is effectively designed to prohibit regulators from enforcing DEI-based frameworks. And it also limits mandatory training to things like professional competence and minimum ethical standards. So it removes this requirement to train on things like cultural competency, DEI, or other topics that the regulator thinks they want to deal with that are unrelated to professional competence and ethics. So the last thing it does is a specific recommendation that I had, which is a statutory standard of review. This has been a huge issue in reviewing cases where professional regulators have overreached because the standard of review that the courts apply is they ask if the regulator was reasonable. That means that the courts give deference to the regulator, even when the regulator does not have any expertise in weighing constitutional guarantees. So they, as a result, get a lot of things wrong. And the bill that Alberta has proposed would introduce a standard of correctness. That means when a court reviews a regulatory's decision for compliance with the charter, that regulatory decision needs to actually be correct. No more deference for regulators who want to regulate speech. They need to show that this action was actually constitutionally correct. And that's one of the things that I specifically asked for. Now, Joanna, one of the things that we want to work at the CCF, one of our big kind of visions is to shift Canada's culture, constitutional culture towards liberty, our legal culture. And I think that this is an amazing example of a government actually taking up a challenge that we laid down, some really clear and specific asks that we had, and running with it. I think that this bill is a huge win for the Canadian Constitution Foundation because this is something we quite literally and specifically called for.
Yeah, it's huge, and you deserve a lot of the credit. Although we've been on this beat for a while, we also had a case with a nurse who was disciplined for complaining about her elderly father's care, and that was a win in the courts. But it's really heartening to see not only this issue is being understood. I think it's misunderstood by a lot of people as being about tall poppies like Jordan Peterson, who can, as you mentioned, actually afford to litigate this stuff when really it's about the very substantial slice of Canadian society, doctors, lawyers, nurses, any regulated profession, and sort of how administrative creep goes in and silences them very substantially, not in the way that, criminal law prohibitions on hate speech, which, well, we have a lot to say about those, and criminal law is a serious sanction, but these are things that any of us could easily stumble into in good faith. And so it's a very important signal. And I certainly hope that it inspires other jurisdictions to follow up. I'm looking at you, Ontario, with your conservative, supposedly charter-loving government. What do you think, Josh?
I'm really excited about the whole bill, and especially the part, just for selfish reasons, that bans certain forms of, DEI training that can be very, very political, from being required for professionals like doctors and lawyers. I believe Alberta, in fact, I'm sure Alberta is one of the provinces where lawyers have to take a course called the Path, which is a 7-hour course in response to calls from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that lawyers be, informed about residential schools, treaties, Aboriginal rights, all things that, I agree they should be informed about. But then the response to that by the Law Society there has been this course, which contains all kinds of very political messages. I took this course myself. It's 7 hours long, and it says things like, for example, that, funds sustaining First Nations communities don't come from tax dollars, which is not true. And it also says that people blocking, railroads and rail lines and roads are land defenders. And, I find that difficult to accept because, if you do that and you say, I block this railroad because I'm a land defender, you're probably going to still, be found guilty of contempt of court if you take that argument to a court. So, these courses are also, pretty redundant in a lot of cases. Like if you go to law school recently, you've learned a lot of these things about, the horrors of residential schools, Aboriginal rights in Canada, et cetera. So I do like this idea of banning the politicized DEI training. I don't know how it'll work in practice, but it's good to see that the government is saying, like, look, no, professional regulators, your job is to make sure They're not, a doctor's not sexually assaulting his patient or that a lawyer is competent. It's not to push a political agenda. So, great bill from Alberta. Thank you, Alberta. So let's take a break. And when we come back, Joanna, you're going to tell us about controversy in Ontario.
Okay, so we're moving from our effusive discussion of what's going on in Alberta to kind of a mess brewing here in Ontario. And of course, it has to do with the Law Society, our regulator. Speaking of regulators, so Ontario's Attorney General, Doug Downey, publicly announced this week that he opposes the Law Society's proposed overhaul of the bar licensing process. He says he doesn't support eliminating the written bar exam, which I'll mention what is being proposed in a moment. To him, he says an objective, right answer, wrong answer test is an important part of proving that new lawyers are ready to practice law, and warning that watering down standards by replacing it with subjective assessments is not acceptable. And his comments force the core issue, the force controversy into focus. Are we strengthening the licensing process, which the Law Society has claimed, or are we smoothing it out? So here's the context. The Law Society has proposed replacing the current multiple choice bar exam with a skills-based course, including simulations, client interviews, drafting exercises evaluated by trained lawyer assessors. And its proponents say that this better reflects real practice. But critics have been saying the moment you remove an objective exam, you invite subjectivity. These lawyer assessors may be inconsistent. Some may have reasons why they're reluctant to fail candidates. It's kind of like an inside system, handshaking the hand. And without a clear pass-fail system, it becomes harder to ensure a consistent standard. So practitioners like Alan Ritchie has argued that subjective person-to-person evaluations, no matter how well intentioned, risk lowering standards and shifting gatekeeping from rules to feel. Now, I actually have kind of mixed views about this because we should all be honest that the current bar exam isn't great either. It's hardly of gold standard. Josh and Christine, all three of us wrote it, and I think you guys would probably agree with me. Certainly, my experience was it's more of an exercise in optimizing than in demonstrating legal competence. You can essentially pass by managing your time during the exam, flipping quickly through your index, and most of all, having a well-constructed index because you're allowed to go in with a big detailed index that basically indicates where to find all of the answers. So people say that success hinges less on understanding the law and more on whether you've built the perfect index, which in turn depends on being in an indexing group through your law school or your friend group. In my case, I went to law school in Quebec, so I had like a group of friends that were summering at a firm that I got in on their index group. And so everybody knows that this is how it works. Also, it has pass rates in the 80-90% range, sometimes even higher. So it's questionable whether the current exam is screening much of anything. But reform should clearly not mean lowering standards. So skepticism is warranted in the reasoning behind the proposed change. The Law Society has mentioned and has leaned heavily on the fact that the exam is quote unquote extremely stressful for candidates, and that internationally trained lawyers often do much worse on the exam. However, a stressful, time-constrained test is something, if you are proposing to be a lawyer, you should be up for. And moreover, you've hopefully navigated through law school, where I had exams that were far, far, far more rigorous and scary. Stress is not necessarily the sign of a broken system, it's just part of professional life. And as for the point about internationally trained candidates, the lower pass rates are often attributed to a lack of networks, as I mentioned, but the more straightforward example is differences in training, familiarity with Ontario law, and unfortunately, that is borne out by the fact that internationally trained lawyers are disproportionately represented in regulatory complaints and discipline matters. So, indeed, they seem to be less competent Ontario lawyers. So, that's not a reason to loosen the standard. So everyone agrees that the current exam doesn't test real lawyering skills, but the solution can't be to eliminate objective measures. Maybe it's to build better ones, something that actually tests drafting, advocacy, ethics, and analysis. So the risk right now is that Ontario is going to trade a flawed system for a softer, more lax one without raising the overall standards. And so the AG's pushback is forcing the Law Society to answer the hard question: is this reform raising competence, or is it simply redistributing the difficulty into a more forgiving, less objective process? So it should also be mentioned that this current exam has only been in place for the last 20 years. It's not always been the way of things. Other provinces like BC are adopting the skills-based course, so this isn't coming out of nowhere. But for me, it's just suspicious when you look at the reasoning of the Law Society that basically they're scared because this is too stressful. I don't know. Josh, I saw you have strong views on this. You were posting on LinkedIn. You want to share them?
I have extremely strong views on this, and it's going to be hard for me not to say all of them. But I don't buy into this networks argument at all. The way it works now is you can just buy or even get a free index, and then what you're doing when you're studying for the exam is you're learning the content by finding it in the index, right? Like there's no way you could pass the exam just by having an index. You have to actually use it to learn the content, and that's what it's doing is testing. Do you have a minimum knowledge of all the content from like the dozens of areas of law that you need to know just to be able to identify legal issues when they come through your door as a lawyer? And so I think it is very good at that. And frankly, like, I just think of back to law school and also articling, and there's a handful of people you encounter that you just think like they're so out of their depth, they're not going to be able to be a competent lawyer. And guess what? Those are the people who end up failing the bar exam. Like in Ontario, it's got an 80+% pass rate on, I think it's after 3 tries. So there is a significant portion that fail, but the people that who are really not going to be competent ever, no matter what they do, are the ones who are failing. And on the international grads thing, like this is supposedly they're doing this for equity reasons and to be more fair to international grads than Canadian trained grads. But the opposite is going to happen as a result of this because they're already stigmatized. Like people already talk about international graduates like, oh, I don't want to hire them. Like I've dealt with international grads and they don't know what they're doing, and they're not as good quality. And the bar exam allows them to prove that they do have that minimal competence, right? So they're supposedly doing this because the international grads only pass at a 50% rate. But if you get rid of the test, then you're going to be even more skeptical about hiring an international grad. And the reason that international grads don't do as well is probably just because it's very hard to get into law school in Canada compared to most countries, right? So you don't have that like filtering mechanism. So anyway, I see this as like a woke attempt to sort of make things easier for people that are probably not going to be competent anyway. And this counter argument that, oh, well, you should just be measuring skills instead. Well, law students don't have those skills, right? So all you can do is measure whether they have the ability to study hard for a test and they know the very basic content of the law so they can at least figure out what legal issue they're dealing with. So anyway, those are my thoughts. Christine, do you agree, disagree? What do you think of the bar exam and getting rid of it?
If people are passing at 80%, why do we need to make it easier? Like that's the foundational question. Like 80% is a high pass rate for being a professional in a demanding and difficult field. 80% is already really high. You don't need to make it easier. And I'm not going to repeat everything you said about international students, but like if you were trained internationally, I think the bar exam is even more important to pass because you didn't go to a Canadian law school. And even if it's not testing the content, because it's more about the index, you still need to prove that you can pass that. Like, full stop. I just don't even understand the rationale here of we need to make an easy exam easier. Like, why? Why? It just doesn't make any sense. Okay, I'm going to shift gears and I'm going to talk about my bad legal take, which Josh always complains that my legal takes are sometimes more like political takes, and this is an example of one. But honestly, it was just too good not to talk about. So recently, Dundas Station, the subway station, was renamed TMU Station, Toronto Metropolitan University Station. And, people are annoyed about this. First of all, because Dundas should never have been renamed. Dundas was unfairly maligned for some reason by City Hall a few years ago. The individual the station's named after is actually a famous like slavery abolitionist in Canada who has an amazing historical record. It's Go and read about him. It's very inspiring. It's like a great person to honor. And for some reason, a few years ago, there was this decision to rename Dundas Station and Dundas Street, and the station has now been renamed TMU. And friend of the pod, Ryan O'Connor, amazing lawyer, he tweeted renaming Dundas subway station to TMU will cost the Toronto public $400,000 in new transit maps alone. Yet the new station signs still read Dundas, presumably because TMU is geographically meaningless to most transit users. Fair point. Great. I agree, Ryan. But this got retweeted by Toronto City Councillor Brad Bradford. And Councillor Bradford, who just can't seem to figure out which side of the fence he's on, retweeted Ryan and said, I wonder if Mayor Chow regrets spending so much political capital on this nonsense. What a waste of time and money. Another useless distraction. And Bradford got a community note for this because Bradford had actually voted in favor of renaming Dundas Station and the entirety of Dundas Street before Olivia Chow was mayor or on council. So actually, Brad Bradford is more responsible for this $400,000 minimum than Olivia Chow was. So bad takes all around for Brad Bradford. Just make up your mind, Brad Bradford. Who are you? What are you? I don't know what to make of you. Just decide who you are and stick with it. Because that community note is wow, humiliating. Joanna, how about you? What's your bad legal take this week?
So last week at Toronto City Hall's Palestinian flag raising ceremony, which I will not comment on for the moment, a counter protester attended and played O Canada on a portable speaker. The cops told him to turn it off, and they cited a municipal bylaw that bans amplified sound at a permitted event unless it's part of the official program. But municipal noise rules don't override charter rights. When police enforce a bylaw at a political event, they are required to interpret it in a way that is minimally impairing. Shutting down a national anthem at a highly contested geopolitical ceremony is the opposite of minimal impairment. The fact that a sound comes from a portable speaker, which it sounds like it wasn't like a loudspeaker, doesn't magically deprive it of constitutional value. Counter protest, symbolism, patriotic expression are all at the core of Section 2B. And police had obvious, less restricted alternatives. They could have told him to turn down the volume. They could have allowed it to be played briefly. They could have exercised their friggin' discretion. And unfortunately, this is just one other instance in a laundry list of cops making bad calls on free expression at these controversial events. Josh, what's your BLT?
My bad legal take goes to Prime Minister Carney for something he said yesterday in question period on a very important topic. And this was in response to a question from Pierre Poilievre about, you have this MOU with Alberta that will allow a pipeline to be built theoretically, but when's it actually going to happen? And Mr. Carney's response was that, BC and other stakeholders' approval is a necessary condition for any oil pipeline because we believe in cooperative federalism. So that may be politically true, and that probably means there will be no pipeline, but constitutionally, that is not what is actually legally correct. So the Constitution of Canada in Section 9110, it makes very, very clear that it is actually the federal government that has exclusive jurisdiction over things like pipelines, which the Constitution calls interprovincial works and undertakings. And this, in fact, is kind of the whole point of Canada. The reason that Canada became a country and that provinces united into one country back in 1867 was so that the provinces could have a chance of fighting back against the U.S. that wanted to swallow us up at the time, very similar to the 51st state rhetoric that we hear now. And to do that, it gave the federal government these powers. It said that if you want to build an interprovincial work or undertaking, that's the federal government's exclusive jurisdiction. It's not the provinces. So it's actually the federal government's job to facilitate things like a pipeline or things like the CP rail that stitched Canada together in the first place. And so I think Mr. Carney needs to learn a bit more about our Constitution because he's falling down on his constitutional duties, in my opinion. All right, so that is the show. Thank you for listening. If you haven't already, please sign up for our Freedom Update newsletter. You can support our work by following us on X, by checking out our YouTube channel. CCF is a nonpartisan charity funded by your donations, so please do click that donate button on our website if you can. Thanks for listening.